Look at this photograph. It's from 1870, somewhere in the American Midwest. There's a building, a grand one, with ornate columns and detailed stonework. Beautiful architecture. Except here's the problem. The ground floor is completely buried. The entrance, the windows, the foundation, all of it 6, 7, maybe 8 feet underground. People are walking at what should be the second story, using it as street level. And this isn't just one building, it's entire city blocks. Now you might think, okay, that's weird, but there's probably a simple explanation, right? Construction, landscaping, maybe they raise the street level. That's what mainstream historians say. But here's where it gets interesting. There are hundreds of these photographs, thousands maybe, from cities across America, Europe, Asia, all from roughly the same period, all showing the same thing. Buildings half swallowed by earth, as if the ground itself rose up and consumed them, or as if something buried them all at once across the entire world. This is the foundation of what's called the mud flood theory. Not a flood of water, but a flood of mud, earth, sediment. A global catastrophe that supposedly swept across continents sometime in the 1800s, burying entire civilizations, resetting history, erasing whole empires from existence. According to believers, the world we think we know is built on top of another world, one we've forgotten or been made to forget. Now, if you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me, where are you right now, and what time is it? I love checking the comments. It's like, Sydney at sunrise, Seattle at midnight, all happening at once. The mud flood isn't accepted by mainstream historians. Not even close. It lives in the realm of alternative history, conspiracy theories, internet rabbit holes. But that doesn't mean it's not fascinating, because the questions it asks, the mysteries it points to, they're real. Why are so many old buildings partially buried? Where did certain architectural styles come from? Why are there gaps in historical records? What happened to all those grand structures that seem too sophisticated for their supposed time period? Tonight, we're going into these stories, not to prove them, not to debunk them, just to explore them, to understand why people believe in lost civilizations and buried empires, to examine the legends, the folklore, the photographs, the architecture that doesn't quite make sense. This isn't about what's true or false. It's about the stories we tell about the past, the mysteries that keep people searching for answers, and the very human need to believe that there's more to history than what we've been told. The thing about the mud flood theory is that it touches something deep, that feeling that we're missing something, that the official story is incomplete. You walk through an old city, you see buildings that seem impossibly grand for their era, built with techniques that supposedly didn't exist yet. You see windows at ground level that clearly used to be higher. You see doorways buried, staircases that start underground, basement levels that feel like they should be first floors, and you wonder, what if there was a world before this one? What if catastrophe struck and buried it? What if we're living in the recovery period, building on top of ruins we don't even recognize as ruins? These questions might sound crazy to historians with their peer-reviewed papers and archaeological evidence. But to the people asking them, they feel urgent, important, like uncovering a truth that's been hidden for generations. Over the next hours, we'll trace the origins of these beliefs. We'll look at the architecture that inspired them, the photographs that seem to show impossible things. We'll explore global flood legends from cultures around the world, stories of catastrophe and renewal that date back thousands of years. we'll investigate the lost empire of Tartaria, a civilization that supposedly spanned continents but vanished from maps and memory. We'll examine real geological events that did bury cities, earthquakes and floods and volcanic eruptions that rewrote landscapes overnight. Most importantly, we'll ask why these stories resonate. What is it about lost civilizations that captures our imagination? Why do we want to believe that we're living on top of buried worlds, that history is deeper and stranger than we've been taught? The truth, as always, is probably more complicated than either the believers or the skeptics want to admit. There are real mysteries in our past. There are explanations that don't quite satisfy. There are questions without good answers. And there are stories, endless stories, whispered across generations, about worlds that came before, catastrophes that reset everything, knowledge that was lost and might still be found. So settle in, get comfortable. Let's dig into the buried earth and see what we find. Let me tell you about a theory that started in the strangest place. Not in an academic journal, not in a documentary series, not even in a published book. The mud flood theory emerged from the depths of internet forums, YouTube videos and Reddit threads around 2016, spreading through online communities like wildfire through dry grass. And here's what makes it fascinating. It wasn't created by conspiracy theorists trying to push an agenda. It was born from genuine curiosity, from people looking at old photographs and asking a simple question. Why do so many 19th century buildings appear to be buried? Because once you start noticing it, you can't stop. Pull up photographs from the 1800s, cities across America, Europe, Asia, and you'll see them. Buildings with windows at ground level that are clearly designed to be basement windows. Doorways half buried, requiring you to descend steps to enter what was obviously meant to be a first floor. Ornate architectural details on what should be upper stories, now sitting at street level. Stone foundations that appear to extend deep underground, far deeper than any basement would reasonably need to go. The pattern is everywhere. Chicago, New York, London, Paris, St. Petersburg, San Francisco. Hundreds of cities, thousands of buildings, all showing the same curious feature. They look buried. Now, conventional history has explanations for this. Urban planners raise street levels to improve drainage and sanitation. Cities built on top of older cities, natural sediment accumulation over decades, individual explanations for individual cases. But here's where the mud flood theory diverged from conventional thinking. What if it wasn't individual cases? What if something much bigger happened? What if there was a single catastrophic event in the 1800s that buried the first floors of buildings across the entire planet? The theory crystallized around a specific claim. Sometime in the 19th century, probably between 1810 and 1850, though dates vary depending on who you ask, a massive mud flood swept across the world. Not water, mud. Thick, dense, catastrophic mud that rose to heights of 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet, burying the ground floors of buildings, covering streets, erasing entire neighborhoods. And then, according to the theory, this event was deliberately hidden from history. The survivors rebuilt on top of the mud, raised their streets, turned their first floors into basements, and never spoke of it again. Or if they did, those records were destroyed, suppressed, erased from the historical narrative by authorities who didn't want people to remember what had really happened. Now, before we go further, let's examine the evidence that sparked this theory, because it's not entirely without foundation. Those photographs are real. The buried buildings exist. You can visit them today in dozens of major cities. The question isn't whether buildings appear partially buried. The question is why. Let's start with the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. This is one of the key events that mud flood theorists point to as evidence of the cover-up. The official story says that much of Chicago burned down in a fire that started supposedly when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. The fire destroyed over 3 square miles of the city, left 100,000 people homeless, and killed around 300 individuals. But here's what makes it interesting to mud flood theorists. The rebuilding happened fast. Incredibly fast. Within just a few years, Chicago had transformed from a devastated ruin into one of America's most impressive cities, filled with massive stone and steel buildings that should have taken decades to construct. And when they rebuilt, they raised the street level. The entire downtown area was elevated, sometimes by as much as 10 feet. Buildings that had survived the fire suddenly found their first floors below the new street level. Doorways that had opened at ground level now required descending stairs. Basement windows became ground floor windows. The official explanation is practical. The city needed better drainage, needed to prevent flooding from Lake Michigan, needed to modernize its infrastructure, so they raised everything. Simple urban planning. But mud flood theorists ask, what if the raising wasn't planned? What if they were covering something up? What if the mud came first, and the fire was either a consequence of the disaster or a convenient story to explain the massive rebuilding that had to happen? And Chicago wasn't alone. The Great Boston Fire of 1872, just 1 year later, the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, major cities across America experienced catastrophic fires that required massive rebuilding efforts. Each time, streets were raised. Each time, first floors became basements. Each time, the rebuilding happened with remarkable speed. Mud flood theorists see a pattern, not individual disasters, but coordinated rebuilding efforts to hide evidence of a much larger catastrophe. Then there's the European evidence. Cities like St. Petersburg, Russia, where entire blocks of ornate 18th and 19th century buildings sit partially buried. London, where Victorian construction often reveals layers of previous occupation far deeper than conventional archaeology would suggest. Paris, where Haussmann's massive renovation in the 1850s and 60s involved raising street levels across huge sections of the city. In each case, there are practical explanations: improving sanitation, preventing flooding, modernizing infrastructure. But in each case, the result is the same: buildings that appear to have been buried. The theory gained momentum when researchers started examining the scale of 19th century urbanization. Because here's something that doesn't quite add up. In 1800, most major cities had populations of a few 100,000 at most. By 1900, cities like New York, London and Paris had populations in the millions. This represents population growth so rapid it's almost unprecedented in human history. And to accommodate this growth, these cities built massive infrastructure projects. Hundreds of miles of sewers, subway systems, gas lines, water mains, all underground. Thousands of massive stone and steel buildings, many of them still standing today, architectural marvels that seem impossibly ambitious for their era. Mud flood theorists look at this and ask, how? How did 19th century societies without modern construction equipment, without computers, without even reliable electric power in many cases, build so much so fast? The standard answer involves Industrial Revolution innovations, mass immigration providing cheap labor, and economic expansion creating capital for investment. But the theorists proposed something different. What if they didn't build it? What if much of this infrastructure already existed? What if the 19th century builders were actually engaged in excavation and restoration, uncovering and repurposing buildings from a previous civilization that had been buried by the mud flood? This is where the theory connects to Tartaria. And if you're not familiar with that name, buckle up, because this is where things get really interesting. Tartaria, sometimes called Tartary, actually does appear on old maps. It was a vague geographical designation used by European cartographers from roughly the 14th through the 19th centuries to describe the vast regions of Central and Northern Asia. The name came from the Tatar peoples, though it was applied inconsistently to territories stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. By the early 1900s, the term had largely disappeared from maps, replaced by more specific designations like Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria. But mudflood theorists proposed something radically different. They claimed Tartaria wasn't just a vague geographical area, it was an actual empire, a highly advanced civilization that controlled much of Asia, Europe, and possibly even the Americas. This Tartarian empire, according to the theory, was responsible for most of the impressive architecture we attribute to the 18th and 19th centuries. Those massive neoclassical buildings, those ornate cathedrals, those elaborately decorated train stations and government buildings. The theorists claim these weren't built by 19th century workers. They were built by Tartarians, a technologically advanced people who possessed construction techniques and possibly energy technologies far beyond what conventional history attributes to that era. Then came the mud flood. The catastrophe struck, burying Tartarian cities under feet of mud, killing millions, destroying the empire. The survivors, smaller nations and kingdoms that had existed on the periphery of Tartarian power, emerged from the disaster and claimed the ruins. They excavated the buildings, removed just enough mud to make them usable again, and presented them as their own constructions. And because Tartaria had been so thoroughly destroyed, because so many of its people had died, there was nobody left to contradict the new narrative. The conquerors wrote the history books, and Tartaria was erased, reduced to a vague geographical term before being removed from maps entirely. The theory explains, or attempts to explain, several things that conventional history struggles with: the rapid urbanization of the 1800s, the seemingly impossible construction projects, the architectural similarities between buildings in different countries and continents, the buried first floors, the missing historical record from certain periods, and most importantly, it provides a grand unified narrative, not dozens of separate urban planning decisions, not hundreds of individual construction projects, but one story that connects everything. And this is where we need to talk about the psychology of alternative narratives. Because the appeal of the mud flood theory isn't just about explaining architectural anomalies, it's about finding meaning in complexity, about replacing hundreds of small disconnected facts with one big comprehensible story. Human brains are pattern recognition machines. We're incredibly good at spotting similarity and connections. It's a survival skill that served our ancestors well. See 3 people get sick after eating the same plant. You learn to avoid that plant. Notice that rain often follows certain cloud formations. You learn to predict weather. This ability to recognize patterns and infer causation kept our species alive. But it also makes us vulnerable to seeing patterns where none exist, to connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. The historical reality of 19th century urbanization is messy and complex. Different cities raised their streets for different reasons at different times. Some did it for drainage, Others did it to bury ruins from fires. Some raised levels to match new bridges or railway stations. Some did it because neighbouring cities had done it, and it seemed like a modern thing to do. Each case requires individual research, understanding local geography, local politics, local economic conditions. It's complicated. It requires holding multiple explanations in your mind simultaneously, accepting that similar effects can have different causes. The mud flood theory offers something simpler: one cause, one effect, one narrative. And narratives are powerful. They're how humans make sense of the world. We don't think in data points and statistical correlations. We think in stories, with beginnings, middles and ends, with heroes and villains, with mysteries and revelations. The conventional explanation for buried buildings doesn't tell a story. It's just facts. Drainage systems, urban planning, sediment accumulation. Boring, disconnected, hard to remember. But a global catastrophe, a lost empire, a conspiracy to hide the truth, that's a story. That engages the narrative centres of our brains. That feels meaningful in a way that gradual sediment accumulation never will. And once you have that narrative framework, everything else starts to fit into it. Every old photograph becomes evidence. Every historical gap becomes suspicious. Every architectural similarity becomes proof of a shared Tartarian origin. The theory becomes self-reinforcing, not because new evidence emerges, but because the narrative lens makes existing evidence appear more significant. There's also a democratic appeal to alternative theories like this. Conventional history is written by academics, by institutions, by people with credentials and degrees. There's a gatekeeping aspect to it. You need access to archives, understanding of historical methodology, often knowledge of multiple languages to read primary sources. It's exclusive in a way that breeds resentment. Mud flood theory, by contrast, is populist. Anyone with internet access can examine old photographs. Anyone can notice buried windows. Anyone can ask questions and propose answers. The evidence is visible, accessible, democratic. You don't need a PhD to see that something looks wrong. And maybe that's the real appeal. Not just the narrative simplicity, but the empowerment. The sense that ordinary people, looking at publicly available photographs, have uncovered something that experts either missed or are deliberately hiding. It's David versus Goliath, outsiders versus gatekeepers, independent researchers versus the academic establishment. That's a compelling position to occupy. It makes you the hero of your own story. But here's the thing about patterns and narratives. Just because something feels true doesn't make it true. Just because a story is satisfying doesn't mean it's accurate. And just because conventional explanations are complicated doesn't mean they're wrong. Sometimes reality is messy. Sometimes similar effects really do have different causes. Sometimes the boring answer is the correct one. The question we need to ask isn't whether the mud flood theory feels right. It's whether the evidence actually supports it. Whether there are testable claims we can examine. Whether alternative explanations might account for the observations just as well or better. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the evidence. The photographs, the buildings, the geological record, the historical documents. We're going to examine what really happened to those first floors, why streets were raised, what catastrophes actually occurred in the 1800s. We're going to explore the real history of Tartaria, what the term actually meant, why it disappeared from maps. Because the truth, when we can find it, is always more interesting than the fiction, even when it's more complicated, even when it doesn't fit into one neat narrative, even when it requires us to hold multiple explanations in our minds at once. The real story of why our cities look the way they do, of what actually happened in the 19th century, of how rapid urbanization transformed the world, that story is worth telling. And it starts with understanding where the mud flood theory came from, what it's really trying to explain, and why so many people found it compelling enough to believe. Let's talk about something that's literally beneath your feet right now. In dozens of cities around the world, there are entire streets, buildings, storefronts, sometimes whole neighborhoods buried underground. You can walk through them today if you know where to look. Real places with real addresses that were once at ground level, now sitting 10, 15, sometimes 30 feet below the modern street. And if you didn't know the actual history, if you just stumbled into these underground spaces without context, you might think something catastrophic had happened. A flood that buried entire cities. A reset that covered the old world with mud and dirt. Evidence of a lost civilization buried beneath our own. This is where mud flood theory gets really interesting, because unlike some of the more speculative claims, the buried buildings are absolutely real. You can touch them. You can walk through them. You can see storefronts with their doors half buried, windows that now open at ankle level, staircases that lead down instead of up. The question isn't whether these buried structures exist. They definitely do. The question is why, and that's where things get complicated. Start with Seattle. If you visit Seattle's underground tour today, guides will walk you through an entire buried city. Old storefronts, sidewalks, building facades, all sitting 1 to 2 stories below the current street level. You'll see old bank vaults, shop windows, even the remnants of old plumbing and electrical systems. It looks exactly like what mud flood theorists describe, a buried civilization, evidence of a catastrophic event that covered the old world. But here's the thing about Seattle's underground. We know exactly why it's there. We have the city records. We have photographs from when it was happening. We have newspaper articles documenting every step of the process. And the reason isn't a mysterious flood or a reset of civilization. It's much simpler and somehow even more interesting. In 1889, a cabinet maker accidentally knocked over a glue pot. The glue was heated over wood shavings which caught fire. The fire spread to turpentine reserves which exploded. Within hours, 25 city blocks were burning. Seattle was built almost entirely of wood at the time, and the city had chronic problems with flooding, because much of downtown was built on tidal flats that would flood twice a day with the tide. So after the fire destroyed downtown, the city made a decision. They would rebuild, but this time they would raise the street level by 1 to 2 stories to solve the flooding problem once and for all. The property owners didn't want to wait. They started rebuilding immediately at the old ground level. Meanwhile, the city began the massive project of raising the streets. They built retaining walls on either side of the roads, filled in the space with dirt hauled in from nearby hills, and created new streets 1 to 2 stories above the old ones. For years, if you walk down the street in downtown Seattle, you'd have to climb ladders or temporary staircases to cross from one block to another, because the streets were being raised in sections. Eventually, they built proper sidewalks at the new street level, with underground passages connecting buildings to each other. The old ground floor entrances became basements. What had been second-story windows became ground level, and the old sidewalks and storefronts were left underground, eventually sealed up and forgotten until they became a tourist attraction decades later. We know all this happened because it was documented in real time. Photographers captured the process. Engineers, filed plans. Newspapers complained about the inconvenience. This wasn't ancient history or mystery. This was the 1890s. There are people alive today whose grandparents remembered when Seattle's streets were being raised. But if you didn't know that history, if someone just showed you photographs of storefronts buried underground, doors half covered with dirt, windows at ankle level, you might think something catastrophic had happened. And that's exactly what mud flood theorists do with dozens of cities around the world. Take San Francisco. After the 1906 earthquake and fire, the city faced a massive problem. Huge amounts of rubble from destroyed buildings. They needed to clear it fast to begin rebuilding. So they made a practical decision. They used the rubble as landfill to expand the city into the bay. Entire neighborhoods were built on top of this rubble. In some areas, the street level rose by 10 or 15 feet. Buildings that survived the earthquake suddenly found their ground floors partially buried. In the rush to rebuild, many property owners simply converted their old ground floors into basements and built new entrances at the new street level. Today, if you know where to look, you can find buildings in San Francisco with ornate facades, decorative stonework, and architectural details that are partially buried below the modern sidewalk. Windows that clearly weren't designed to be basement windows sitting half underground. Doorways that now open below street level. Without context, it looks exactly like evidence of a civilization burying flood. With context, it's just urban planning and earthquake recovery. But Seattle and San Francisco are recent examples. We have photographs, records, live in memory. What about older cities? What about the medieval European cities where buildings have 2, 3, sometimes 4 levels of basements, and the modern street is 20 feet above what was clearly once ground level? Rome is a perfect example. Modern Rome sits approximately 30 feet above ancient Rome in many areas. You can tour ancient Roman houses where the ground floor is now deeply underground. Streets that Roman citizens walked on are now buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris, and this isn't evidence of a catastrophic flood. It's evidence of time. Here's what happens to cities over centuries. Buildings collapse, wars destroy neighborhoods, fires reduce entire districts to ash and rubble, and almost always people rebuild on top of the ruins rather than clearing them away. It's easier. The rubble provides a stable foundation. Over time, the street level rises gradually, generation by generation. A few inches per decade doesn't seem like much, but over 1,000 years it adds up to 20 or 30 feet. Medieval cities also deliberately raise street levels to deal with sanitation problems. When your city's sewage system consists of throwing waste into the street and hoping rain will wash it away, raising the street level periodically became a public health measure. They'd literally pave over the old filth, creating a new, cleaner street surface. The ground floors of buildings would become basements. New doors would be cut at the higher level, and life would continue until the new street level became too disgusting, and the process would repeat. London has sections where you can see 4 or 5 distinct street levels stacked on top of each other, each representing a different era of the city's development. Medieval Street, Tudor Street, Georgian Street, Victorian Street, Modern Street, all preserved in layers like an archaeological cake. And at each level, you find buildings with their ground floors now underground, looking exactly like they were buried by some catastrophic event. But perhaps the most compelling buried structures are the ornate 19th century buildings that mud flood theorists point to as evidence of an advanced lost civilization. Because here's something that does require explanation. Walk through any major city built in the 1800s and you'll see architectural details that seem almost impossible for the technology of the time. Massive stone buildings with perfect symmetry. Ornate facades with thousands of hand-carved decorative elements. Enormous public buildings with soaring domes and intricate stonework. Buildings like the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, which covered 600 acres with elaborate neoclassical architecture that looked like something from ancient Rome or a fantasy novel. Mud flood theorists look at these buildings and ask a reasonable question. How did people in the 1890s, supposedly primitive by our standards, create architecture this sophisticated? They didn't have computer-aided design. They didn't have modern construction equipment. They had horses and hand tools, and yet they built structures that modern architects struggle to replicate. Doesn't that suggest these buildings weren't actually built in the 1890s? Doesn't that suggest they were inherited from a more advanced civilization and the Victorians just claimed credit? Here's where we need to talk about the World's Fair conspiracy, because this is where mud flood theory intersects with some genuinely fascinating architectural history. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair really did look impossibly grand. Photographs show enormous neoclassical buildings, dozens of them, covered with elaborate sculptures and decorative elements. Visitors described it as the most beautiful place they'd ever seen. It looked permanent, eternal, like it had been there for centuries. But here's the thing, those buildings weren't made of stone. They were made of staff, a mixture of plaster, cement and fibre, coated over wooden frames. They were temporary structures, designed to last just long enough for the fair. After the fair ended, most of them were demolished or destroyed by fire. They never were permanent buildings. They were essentially movie sets, elaborate facades designed to create an impression of grandeur. This is where the conspiracy gets interesting. Because if you didn't know those buildings were temporary, if you just saw photographs of this elaborate city that appeared seemingly overnight and then vanished just as quickly, you might think something strange had happened. You might think the official story that they were built in just a few years for a temporary fair was a cover-up. You might think they were actually remnants of a lost civilization that the authorities demolished to hide evidence. But we know exactly how those buildings were constructed because the architects and engineers documented everything. We have their plans. We have photographs of the construction process showing the wooden frames and plaster coating. We have accounts from workers who built them. We have records of how they were demolished. There's no mystery here, just impressive craftsmanship using theatrical construction techniques. But that still leaves the question of the permanent 19th century buildings, the real stone structures, the cathedrals and government buildings and train stations that really were built to last. Because those are genuinely impressive and they deserve explanation. Here's what people forget about the 19th century. It wasn't primitive, it was the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated architectural knowledge. By the 1800s, European and American builders had access to architectural techniques refined over millennia. They had Roman engineering principles, medieval cathedral building expertise, Renaissance mathematical innovations. They had detailed architectural pattern books that documented exactly how to create every classical element. They had training programs that took stonemasons and carvers from apprenticeship through journeyman to master craftsmen over decades. And they had something else, a massive labour force and no labour laws. Those elaborate carved facades weren't created by a handful of artists. They were created by hundreds of stoneworkers, each spending months or years carving individual elements. That ornate, cornice that looks impossibly detailed. It might have taken a master carver 3 months to complete, working 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Multiply that by hundreds of decorative elements and hundreds of workers, and you can build something that looks impossibly grand by modern standards. We don't build like that anymore, not because we've lost the knowledge, but because we've lost the economic model that made it possible. In the 19th century, skilled labour was relatively cheap, and building materials were expensive, so it made economic sense to invest enormous amounts of hand labour into permanent structures. Today, labour is expensive and materials are relatively cheap, so we build faster using prefabricated elements and simplified designs. But there's another phenomenon that makes historic buildings look buried even when they aren't. Ground level changes naturally over time through a process called soil deposition. Streets accumulate dust, debris, leaves, all organic matter. Rain washes soil down from higher elevations. Rivers flood and leave behind layers of silt. Over decades and centuries, the ground level rises naturally, especially in river valleys and low-lying areas. This is why so many historic buildings have what look like sunken gardens or ground floors that are partially below modern street level. The building hasn't sunk. The ground around it has risen. If you built a house today and came back in 200 years, you might find the ground level 6 inches to a foot higher than when you built it, assuming the area hadn't been deliberately maintained. In wet climates, this process accelerates. In flood-prone areas, it can happen even faster. This is why medieval European cities often have buildings where the original ground floor is now half underground. Not because of some catastrophic mud flood, but because of 2 centuries of normal soil deposition combined with periodic deliberate street raising for sanitation and flood control. But here's where mud flood theory gets something importantly right, even if the interpretation is wrong. Our ancestors really were more capable than we often give them credit for. The default assumption in popular culture is that people in the past were primitive, that technology and capability have only moved in one direction, always forward, always progressing. So when we see evidence of sophisticated ancient engineering, Roman concrete that outlasts modern formulas, medieval cathedrals with acoustics that modern architects struggle to replicate, 19th century stonework that would be prohibitively expensive today, our first instinct is to assume it must be fake or misattributed. But it's not. People in the past really were that skilled. They had different knowledge bases, different priorities, and different economic structures that allowed them to create things we find difficult to replicate. Not because they had lost ancient super technology, but because they invested time and resources differently than we do. The buried buildings of Seattle aren't evidence of a mud flood. They're evidence of ambitious urban planning. The underground spaces in Rome aren't evidence of a reset. They're evidence of 2,000 years of continuous occupation. The ornate architecture of the 1800s isn't evidence of inherited structures from a lost civilization. It's evidence of what humans can create when they combine accumulated knowledge, skilled labour, and sufficient time. But they're also evidence of something else. Evidence that history is more complex than the simple narratives we're often taught. Evidence that cities are dynamic things, constantly being rebuilt, raised, lowered, and modified. Evidence that the ground beneath our feet isn't stable, that street levels change, that what was once above ground can become buried without any catastrophic event required. Walk through any old city and you're walking through layers of history, sometimes literally. The Victorian street was built over the Georgian street, which was built over the medieval street, which was built over Roman foundations, each generation building on top of what came before. not burying evidence of lost civilizations, just doing what humans have always done, adapting, rebuilding, and moving forward while leaving traces of the past beneath their feet. Because here's the thing about human memory. We don't just remember what happened yesterday or last year or even in our own lifetimes. We remember events that happened thousands of years before we were born. Events that happened before writing, before cities, before agriculture. We remember them in stories. Stories passed down through so many generations that they've transformed into myths, legends, sacred texts. But underneath the gods and monsters and miraculous survivals, there might be something real. Something that actually happened. Let's start with the most famous flood story in Western civilization, Noah's Ark. You know this one. God decides humanity has become too wicked, plans to destroy the world with a flood, tells one righteous man to build a boat and save his family, plus breeding pairs of every animal. The waters rise, covering even the highest mountains. Everything dies except what's on the boat. After months afloat, the waters recede and Noah's family repopulates the earth. But here's what most people don't realize. The Noah story isn't original. It's actually a relatively late addition to a much older tradition of flood narratives that stretches back thousands of years before the Bible was written. The oldest written flood story we have comes from ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, carved on clay tablets around 2100 BCE, but preserving stories that are probably much older. In this version, the hero isn't Noah, he's Utnapishtim. The gods aren't concerned with human wickedness, they're just annoyed by how noisy humans have become. Can't sleep with all that racket down there, so they decide to wipe everything out with a flood, but one god, Ea, warns Utnapishtim, tells him to build a boat, make it waterproof with pitch and bitumen, bring his family and representatives of every living creature. The flood comes. 6 days and 6 nights of rain so intense it terrifies even the gods who caused it. Everything is destroyed. When the waters finally recede, Utnapishtim sends out birds to search for dry land. First a dove, then a swallow, finally a raven that doesn't return. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice. The gods smell the offering and gather around it like flies, suddenly grateful that someone survived to make offerings to them. Sound familiar? The parallels to Noah are unmistakable. Warned by a god, builds a boat, saves animals, birds searching for land, sacrifice after landing. Either the biblical authors borrowed from Gilgamesh, or both stories are drawing from an even older tradition. A memory of something that actually happened, elaborated and mythologized over thousands of years. But it doesn't stop there. The ancient Greeks had their own flood story. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, is warned by his father that Zeus plans to destroy humanity with a catastrophic flood. Deucalion builds a chest, takes his wife Pyrrha, survives 9 days and nights of rain that drowns everyone else. Their boat lands on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. Different details, same basic structure. Warning from a deity, catastrophic flood. One family survives. Humanity gets a fresh start. Now, you might think these are just Middle Eastern and Mediterranean stories, maybe all connected by trade and cultural exchange. But the flood legends go global, way beyond any possible contact between cultures. In Hindu cosmology, the universe goes through endless cycles of creation and destruction. One of the most important texts, the Matsya Purana, tells the story of Manu, the first human. A small fish asks Manu for protection, promising to save him from a coming disaster. Manu protects the fish as it grows larger and larger, eventually becoming enormous. The fish warns Manu that a great deluge is coming that will destroy all life. Manu builds a boat, loads it with seeds and animals, and when the flood comes, the giant fish tows his boat to safety. After the waters recede, Manu repopulates the earth. Same story, completely different cultural context. Hindu civilization developed independently of Mesopotamian culture, yet they're telling essentially the same tale. One righteous person warned, builds a boat, survives a world-destroying flood, starts over. The pattern continues in East Asia. Ancient Chinese texts describe legendary floods that covered the earth during the reign of Emperor Yao, around 2300 BCE according to traditional chronology. The waters were so high they reached the heavens. People took refuge in mountains and trees, but still drowned in massive numbers. The situation was so desperate that Emperor Yao appointed a man named Gun to control the floods. Gun tried for 9 years, but failed. Eventually his son Yu took over, and through tireless work dredged channels, created irrigation systems, and finally controlled the waters. The Chinese version focuses more on human effort than divine intervention, but the core is the same. Catastrophic flooding that nearly destroys civilization, narrow survival, and the need to completely rebuild society afterward. Cross the Pacific to the Americas, and the flood stories keep coming. The Aztecs believed the world had been destroyed and recreated 4 times before the current age. One of those destructions was by flood, water covering everything, transforming humans into fish. The Incas told of a flood that drowned everyone except a shepherd and his family who took refuge in a high mountain cave with their llamas. When the waters receded, they repopulated the earth. Native American tribes across North America preserve their own flood traditions. The Ojibwe tell of a man warned by animals that a great flood was coming. He built a raft and saved representatives of each animal species. The Lakota speak of ancestors who survived a world-destroying flood by climbing to high peaks. The Cree describe waters that covered the earth until a muskrat dove to the bottom and brought up mud to create new land. These stories were being told for thousands of years before any European contact. There's no way they borrowed from biblical tradition. They're independent memories of something that happened long ago. Even more remarkable are the flood legends from Australia, because they contain details that archaeologists can actually verify. Aboriginal peoples from all around the Australian coast tell stories of times when the ocean was much lower, when you could walk to islands that are now separated by deep water. They describe ancestors living on coastal plains that are now underwater, being forced to flee inland as the seas rose. The young people of northern Australia tell of a time when their ancestors could walk to what are now distant islands, gathering food from lands that are now beneath the sea. The Ngarrindjeri of South Australia describe their ancestors fleeing rising waters that swallowed coastal settlements. Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples preserve stories of a time when Tasmania was connected to the mainland by a land bridge that you could walk across. Here's what makes these stories extraordinary. We can check them. Geological evidence confirms that sea levels were indeed much lower during the last ice age, which ended about 12,000 years ago. As massive ice sheets melted, ocean levels rose by more than 400 feet, flooding coastal areas worldwide. The land bridge to Tasmania was submerged around 8,000 years ago. Islands that were once connected became isolated. Vast stretches of coastal plain disappeared beneath the waves. Aboriginal Australians have been preserving accurate memories of geological events that happened 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. That's 300 to 400 generations of oral tradition maintaining specific, verifiable details about real landscape changes. This isn't myth. This is history transmitted through story across time spans that seem impossible. Pacific Islander traditions contain similar verified memories. Stories from Hawaii, Samoa, Tonga, and other island groups describe ancestral homelands that sank beneath the ocean. They tell of great kingdoms that existed on lands now underwater, of migrations forced by rising seas. Some researchers dismiss these as fantasies of lost civilizations, but geological surveys confirm that Pacific sea levels did rise dramatically after the Ice Age, and many low-lying areas that were once habitable are now submerged. The Polynesians, master navigators who colonized the vast Pacific, preserved incredibly detailed oral traditions about islands, currents, and navigation routes. It's not a stretch to think they also preserved accurate memories of dramatic landscape changes their ancestors witnessed. So what's going on here? Why do cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, cultures with no possible contact with each other, all tell stories about world-destroying floods? The standard academic explanation used to be that floods are common, people everywhere experience them, so it's natural that many cultures would develop flood stories independently, but that doesn't really work, does it? Local floods happen all the time, but these stories aren't about rivers overflowing or heavy rain seasons. They describe world-ending catastrophes, waters covering mountains, complete destruction of previous civilizations. They're too specific, too similar, too widespread to be just coincidental elaborations of normal flooding. Some researchers argue all the stories trace back to one ancient culture that experienced a major flood, then spread the story as they migrated around the world. But the timeline doesn't work. These cultures developed independently, often separated by tens of thousands of years. The more likely explanation is that these stories preserve actual memories of real catastrophic events. Not one single global flood that covered the entire Earth. That's geologically impossible in recorded human history. But multiple major flooding events that would have seemed world-ending to the people who experienced them. At the end of the last Ice Age, between about 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, the world experienced dramatic and rapid climate change. Massive ice sheets that had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia melted over just a few thousand years. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet. Coastlines changed dramatically. Entire regions that had been inhabited for thousands of years were submerged. But the process wasn't smooth. There were episodes of catastrophic flooding. The Missoula floods in North America, caused by the repeated failure of ice dams, sent walls of water across thousands of square miles, carving channels and creating landscapes that look alien even today. Similar catastrophic floods happened in Siberia, Europe, and Asia as ice dams failed and meltwater surged across the land. There's also evidence for the Black Sea deluge hypothesis, the idea that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam at the Bosphorus, flooding into the Black Sea basin with the force of 200 Niagara Falls. If people were living around the shores of what was then a freshwater lake, this would have been absolutely catastrophic. Entire settlements drowning in a matter of days or weeks. Populations forced to flee inland, carrying stories of the disaster with them. Recent geological work has identified multiple other possible catastrophic flood events. The flooding of the Persian Gulf as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. Major tsunami events caused by underwater landslides or earthquakes. Volcanic eruptions triggering sudden massive flooding. Any of these could have been experienced by human populations as world-ending disasters. And here's the key point. When a catastrophe destroys most of your society, when everyone you know dies except a few survivors, when your entire world is literally washed away, you remember it. You tell your children about it. They tell their children. The story gets passed down, generation after generation. Details change, gods and heroes get added, miraculous elements emerge, but the core memory remains. Water came. Everything was destroyed. A few people survived. We started over. Over thousands of years, these memories transform into myths. But they're not fantasies. They're the only history books preliterate societies had. Oral traditions preserving information about real events that shape the human experience. This is why flood legends matter for understanding mud flood theories and lost civilization narratives. They demonstrate that human societies can and do preserve memories of actual catastrophic events across vast spans of time. They show that dramatic landscape changes have happened within human memory. They prove that civilizations have been destroyed by natural disasters, that knowledge has been lost, that people have had to start over from scratch. But they also show something else: human resilience. Every flood story ends the same way. A few survivors, determination to rebuild, civilization emerging again from the ruins. We've been through apocalypses before, multiple times, in multiple places, and we've always survived, always remembered, always told the story to the next generation. These stories are in our bones, part of the human inheritance. The memory of disasters that nearly destroyed us but didn't. The knowledge that the world can change catastrophically, overnight, without warning, and the confidence that somehow we'll survive anyway. Here's where things get really interesting, because if you go online and start looking at old maps from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, you're going to find something that modern atlases don't show. A massive territory stretching across Central Asia labelled Tartary or Tartaria. And according to a growing number of alternative historians, this isn't just an old name for a region. It's evidence of a vast, technologically advanced civilization that once dominated the planet. A civilization that was deliberately erased from history. Now, before we dive into the theory, let's talk about what Tartary actually was, because it did exist. European cartographers used the name Tartary or Tartaria to describe the vast expanses of Central and Northern Asia that they knew very little about. The name came from Tartar, a term Europeans used for various Turkic and Mongol peoples, mixed with the Latin suffix "ea" for a region. So basically, land of the Tartars. On old maps you'll see it divided up. Grand Tartary covering most of Central Asia, Chinese Tartary in the east, Muscovite Tartary in the north, Independent Tartary, Free Tartary. These weren't unified political entities. They were European attempts to label vast territories inhabited by nomadic peoples, settled khanates, and various ethnic groups that didn't fit neatly into European categories of nationhood. The actual history of these regions is complicated. You had the remnants of the Mongol Empire fragmenting into various khanates, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Dzunga Khanate. You had Turkic peoples, indigenous Siberian groups, the expansion of the Russian Empire gradually absorbing these territories. By the 19th century, most of what European maps had labelled Tartary was either part of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty in China, or the Ottoman sphere of influence. The name gradually disappeared from maps, not because of any conspiracy, but because Europeans gained more accurate knowledge of the region and started using more specific geographic and political terminology. But here's what the alternative theory says. Tartary wasn't just a vague geographic label. It was a globe-spanning empire, an advanced civilization that had developed technologies we're only rediscovering today. And sometime in the 1800s, this empire was destroyed in a cataclysm, conquered, its history deliberately rewritten, its achievements attributed to other civilizations. According to this narrative, evidence of Tartaria is everywhere. You just have to know how to see it. Look at the grand buildings of the 19th century, the ornate cathedrals, government buildings, railway stations, opera houses, buildings with soaring domes, elaborate facades, classical columns, intricate stonework, buildings that seem impossibly grand for their supposed construction dates, buildings that, according to Tartaria theorists, weren't built by Americans, Russians, or Europeans at all. They were inherited from the Tartarian Empire. The story goes something like this. In cities across the world, from San Francisco to St. Petersburg, from Melbourne to Mumbai, you'll find architectural styles that are remarkably similar. Neoclassical design, Baroque elements, identical construction techniques. Buildings that official history says were built in the mid to late 1800s by various cultures independently. But Tartaria theorists see something else. They see the remnants of a unified civilization, buildings that were already standing when current populations arrived, structures that were claimed, repurposed, and falsely dated to hide their true origins. Look at photographs from the late 1800s, early 1900s. You'll see these magnificent structures surrounded by primitive dirt streets, simple wooden buildings, undeveloped infrastructure. Why would people capable of building muddy roads construct architectural masterpieces? The Tartaria theory answers this question directly. They didn't build them. They found them. The grand buildings were already there, survivors of the pre-cataclysm Tartarian civilization. The new inhabitants simply moved in and claimed credit. And here's where the theory gets really elaborate. Because Tartaria theorists don't just claim these buildings were inherited, they claim they were functional technology that we no longer understand how to use. Specifically, these buildings were power generation stations, free energy devices that extracted electricity directly from the atmosphere. Look at the architecture more carefully, they say. Notice the ornate spires, towers, and domes. Notice how many of these buildings feature elaborate metalwork at their highest points. According to the theory, these weren't decorative elements. They were antennae. Atmospheric electricity collectors working on principles similar to Tesla's later experiments, but on a much grander scale. The buildings themselves were designed as resonance chambers, their specific proportions and materials creating harmonic frequencies that amplified and distributed electrical energy. This explains, theorists argue, why so many of these buildings feature massive interior spaces with domed ceilings. The domes weren't just aesthetic choices. They were functional components of the energy system, creating specific acoustic and electromagnetic properties. It explains the elaborate ventilation systems, the unexplained towers and minarets, the curious architectural features that don't seem to serve any obvious purpose in conventional understanding. And those old world's fairs, the great exhibitions of the late 1800s and early 1900s, where magnificent temporary structures were supposedly built and then demolished, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the Paris Exposition of 1889, dozens of others featuring impossible-seeming architecture built in absurdly short time frames. According to Tartaria theorists, these weren't temporary constructions at all. They were existing Tartarian structures, briefly revealed to the public under the guise of being new constructions, then demolished to hide the evidence of the old civilization. the theory extends to explain population movements too. Why did so many people migrate to new territories in the 1800s? Why were there orphan trains carrying thousands of children across America? Why do some theorists claim photographic evidence shows cities that appear empty or underpopulated despite grand infrastructure? Because, they say, these were areas being repopulated after the Tartarian cataclysm. The orphans weren't parentless children from cities. They were survivors being relocated. The settlers weren't pioneering new territories. They were moving into lands emptied by catastrophe. This is where the mud flood narrative connects directly to Tartaria. The mud flood, according to this theory, was the weapon or event used to destroy the Tartarian Empire. Cities were buried, populations decimated, survivors left with fragmented knowledge and no way to operate the advanced technology around them. The New Order deliberately obscured this history, rewrote timelines, created false narratives about construction dates and builders. Within a few generations, nobody remembered the truth. The magnificent structures were attributed to contemporary builders. The advanced technology was dismissed as decoration. The global empire was reduced to a footnote about Central Asian nomads. Now, let's take a breath and look at what actually happened. Because there's a much simpler explanation for everything Tartaria theorists are pointing to, and it's actually a fascinating story in its own right. The 19th century saw an unprecedented wave of architectural standardization across the world. This wasn't because of a lost empire, it was because of a connected one. The British Empire, European colonial powers, and American expansion created networks of cultural exchange and architectural standardization that spanned the globe. When you wanted to build an important civic building in the 1800s, there were established styles that communicated legitimacy and authority. Neoclassical architecture, borrowed from ancient Greece and Rome, signaled democracy and enlightenment. Baroque and Gothic revival styles communicated religious or cultural sophistication. These styles spread because architects studied the same reference books, trained in the same traditions, and deliberately copied what worked. The reason these buildings look similar in Melbourne, Manchester, and Montreal isn't because they were built by the same lost civilization. It's because architects in all three cities were referencing the same classical traditions and contemporary pattern books. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris trained architects from across the world in standardized techniques and aesthetic principles. Architectural journals circulated globally. Successful designs were copied, adapted, and re-implemented. This was intentional cultural exchange, not evidence of a hidden empire. As for those ornate towers and spires, they served multiple documented purposes. Some were bell towers for churches, some housed clock mechanisms for civic buildings. Many were ventilation systems for the massive interior spaces below, using passive air circulation principles that are well understood. The decorative metalwork on top often included lightning rods, a new safety technology being widely adopted in the 19th century. These weren't atmospheric electricity collectors. They were protection against atmospheric electricity, keeping buildings from burning down during storms. The world's fairs? We have extensive documentation of their construction. Thousands of photographs showing the building process, detailed architectural plans, payroll records for workers, contemporary newspaper accounts. The buildings were indeed constructed quickly, but not impossibly so. They were designed to be temporary, built from plaster and wood frames rather than permanent stone. That's why they could go up in months and why most were demolished afterward. Keeping them standing would have required extensive maintenance and rebuilding with permanent materials. Most host cities chose not to make that investment. and the reason these magnificent structures sometimes appear in photographs surrounded by unpaved streets and simple buildings. Because in rapidly growing cities, development was uneven. You'd often construct major civic buildings and infrastructure first, while residential and commercial areas were still developing. This was standard urban planning, not evidence of inherited architecture. American cities in particular grew explosively in the late 1800s. It wasn't unusual to see a brand new courthouse or railway station rise in an area that was still largely undeveloped, with the surrounding city gradually filling in over subsequent decades. The historical Tatar peoples and Central Asian Khanates had rich, complex histories that don't require imagining impossible empires. The Mongol conquest in the 13th century created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Its fragmentation left successor states across Asia that maintained sophisticated cultures, trade networks, and cities. The Silk Road connected east and west centuries before Europeans explored it. Islamic architecture from this region influenced building styles across 3 continents. But this influence happened through documented cultural exchange, not through a hidden global empire. What we're seeing with Tartaria theory is pattern recognition gone into overdrive. Human brains are incredibly good at spotting patterns. It's one of our most valuable survival traits. But we're so good at it that we often see patterns that aren't really there. When you start looking at 19th century architecture with the assumption that it hides evidence of a lost civilization, you can find things to support that narrative. Similar building styles become evidence of a unified empire rather than cultural exchange. Elaborate decoration becomes mysterious technology rather than aesthetic preference. Rapid construction becomes impossible unless the buildings already existed. This tendency is amplified by how history is actually recorded and taught. Historical education focuses on narratives that fit conventional timelines. The messy details get left out. We learn about major events and famous people, but not always about the mundane reality of how cities developed or buildings were constructed. This creates gaps in common knowledge. Gaps that alternative theories can fill with more dramatic narratives. There's also something appealing about the idea that conventional history is wrong, that there's hidden knowledge available only to those who look carefully enough. It makes the believer special, initiated into truths that mainstream historians miss or deliberately hide. This isn't unique to Tartaria theory. It's a feature of most alternative historical narratives. The satisfaction of seeing what others don't. The appeal of being proved right when everyone else is fooled. But here's what's genuinely interesting. The questions Tartaria theorists ask aren't completely unreasonable. How did rapidly growing 19th century cities construct such elaborate buildings? Why does architectural style standardize globally during this period? What happened to all the historical record from Central Asian civilizations? These are legitimate questions. They just have less dramatic answers than a lost empire. The reality is that the 19th century was a period of unprecedented technological and social change. Industrialization provided new construction techniques and materials. Steam power and railways moved those materials quickly. Telegraph communications spread ideas across continents. Photography documented the changes. Public education created literate populations that demanded civic institutions. Colonialism and empire building spread European cultural norms globally. All of this happened in a few generations. The world changed faster than it ever had before. That rapid change, documented in photographs and maps but not always well explained, creates the perception of discontinuity. Things look different between 1850 and 1900 because they were different. Cities that barely existed in 1860 were major metropolises by 1890. Technologies that didn't exist in 1870 were commonplace by 1900. This wasn't because of a hidden empire. It was because human civilization was transforming itself at a rate that had never before been possible. As for real Tartary, the actual history of Central Asia in the period when European maps still labelled it thus, is full of genuine intrigue. Multiple Khanates competing for control of Silk Road trade routes, the expansion of Russian and Chinese imperial power into territories they'd never fully controlled, indigenous peoples navigating between empires, cultural and technological exchange between East and West, the gradual transition from nomadic to settled lifestyles in some regions while others maintained ancient patterns. This real history is complex, sometimes contradictory, and full of stories that don't fit neat narratives, which is exactly what real history usually looks like. So when you see claims about Tartarian architecture, free energy buildings, and deliberately hidden history, remember this. The 19th century really was a time of dramatic change. Buildings really were constructed quickly using new techniques. Architectural styles really did standardize globally. But these things happened through documented processes: cultural exchange, technological development, economic transformation. The real story doesn't require imagining impossible empires. It just requires understanding that sometimes, especially during periods of rapid change, the mundane truth is actually more remarkable than the fantastic alternative. 'Cause here's the thing about mud flood mythology. Strip away the conspiracy theories, remove the claims about hidden empires and deliberate cover-ups, and you're left with something genuinely fascinating. Real catastrophic floods, real buried cities, real evidence that sometimes entire civilizations can disappear under layers of mud and ash in a matter of hours. The question isn't whether catastrophic floods have buried human settlements. They absolutely have. The question is what actually happened, and whether we need mysterious lost empires to explain it, or whether geology, climate, and the violent nature of our planet can account for everything we see. Let's start with the most famous buried city in history, Pompeii. Everyone knows the story. Roman city, prosperous and wealthy, sitting at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. August 24th, 79 CE, the mountain explodes. Ash and pumice rain down for hours, then comes the surge, superheated gas and pulverized rock moving at hundreds of miles per hour, killing everyone instantly and burying the entire city under layers of volcanic material. But here's what most people don't realize about Pompeii. It wasn't just buried in ash. Much of what covered the city was actually mud. Volcanic lahars, mixture of ash, rock, and water that flows like concrete and hardens almost as solid. When Vesuvius erupted, it ejected millions of tons of material into the atmosphere. That material mixed with moisture in the air and fell as wet, heavy ash. Then came the pyroclastic surges, and after those actual lahars, mud flows triggered by the disruption of the mountain's drainage systems. By the time it was over, Pompeii lay under 13 to 20 feet of volcanic material. The nearby town of Herculaneum got it even worse, buried under more than 60 feet of superheated mud that flowed through the streets like lava, filling every space, penetrating every building. That mud was so hot it carbonized wood instantly, so deep it completely erased the towns from the landscape. For over 1,500 years, nobody even knew where Pompeii was. The city had literally vanished, their locations forgotten, their existence reduced to vague references in ancient texts that scholars weren't entirely sure they could trust. This is a real mud flood. Catastrophic, complete, capable of erasing major population centers so thoroughly that their locations become lost to history. And it's happened countless times throughout human existence. In 1902, Mount Pelée in Martinique erupted and buried the city of Saint-Pierre under pyroclastic flows. 30,000 people died in minutes. The mud and ash came so fast that entire buildings were buried to their rooftops. Survivors described a wall of superheated mud rushing down the mountain faster than horses could run. Today, archaeologists excavating Saint-Pierre find exactly what mudflood theorists describe in their photos. Buildings with only their top floors visible, streets buried under hardened mud, the appearance of a city that sank into the earth. But we know exactly what happened here. We have eyewitness accounts, photographs taken before and after, scientific measurements of the eruption, no mysterious empire needed, no ancient catastrophe, just a volcano doing what volcanoes do, which is occasionally bury everything nearby under massive amounts of volcanic debris. This pattern repeats throughout history. Akrotiri on the island of Santorini, buried by the massive Minoan eruption around 1600 BCE. The ancient Indonesian city of Tambora, destroyed and buried by the 1815 eruption that caused the year without a summer. Armero in Colombia, buried under 15 feet of mud when Nevado del Ruiz erupted in 1985, killing 23,000 people in a matter of hours. Volcanic lahars are particularly devastating because they don't just bury things, they infiltrate. Mud flows into every opening, fills every space, and then hardens like concrete. When it finally solidifies, it preserves everything it covered in remarkable detail, creating the perfect conditions for future archaeologists to find buildings that look like they've been deliberately buried, with only their upper stories visible. But volcanoes aren't the only geological process capable of burying entire settlements. Let's talk about earthquakes and liquefaction. Put simply, liquefaction happens when waterlogged soil loses its structural integrity during seismic shaking. The ground literally behaves like a liquid. Buildings don't collapse, they sink. Roads don't crack, they submerge. Entire neighborhoods can drop several feet in seconds, then get covered by mud and water flowing in from surrounding areas. The 1964 Alaska earthquake triggered massive liquefaction across Anchorage. Entire subdivisions sank 10, 15, sometimes 20 feet. Houses that had been on ground level ended up with only their roofs visible. Cars, roads, trees, all submerged beneath mud and sediment that flowed in to fill the voids created by the sinking land. In the 2011 Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, liquefaction was so severe that some areas of the city had to be completely abandoned. Buildings sank unevenly, some tilting at crazy angles, others dropping straight down so their second floors became ground floors, buried under feet of liquefied soil that hardened once the shaking stopped. This process can make modern buildings look ancient. A structure built in 2010 can appear centuries old after a major liquefaction event, its lower floors completely buried, its architectural features obscured by hardened mud. Without historical records, archaeologists excavating these sites in the distant future might assume they're looking at much older structures that were gradually buried over time, and that brings us to the more gradual processes. Because not all catastrophic burials happen in minutes. Some take centuries, but the end result looks identical. Sedimentation is the slow accumulation of soil, dust and debris that happens everywhere all the time. In river valleys, annual floods deposit thin layers of silt. In cities, wind carries dust that settles on streets and buildings. Vegetation grows, dies, decomposes, and adds organic matter to the soil. Over decades and centuries, these processes can raise ground levels significantly. Rome is a perfect example. The ancient city is buried under modern Rome, but not because of any catastrophe. The Forum, the centre of the ancient city, now sits 25 feet below the modern street level. Why? 2,000 years of accumulation. Flooding from the Tiber River, construction debris from buildings that collapsed and were built over, soil washing down from the surrounding hills, trash and refuse that ancient Romans dumped in the streets faster than it could be cleaned away. By the medieval period, people were literally walking on top of ancient Rome, sometimes not even realizing there were entire buildings beneath their feet. When excavations began in the 18th and 19th centuries, archaeologists found temples, houses, and public buildings buried under dozens of feet of accumulated soil and debris. To someone unfamiliar with the gradual nature of these processes, it looks like a mud flood, like the entire ancient city sank into the earth or was deliberately buried. The same pattern appears in archaeological sites worldwide. Ancient Jericho sits beneath 70 feet of accumulated debris from thousands of years of continuous occupation. The ancient city of Troy consists of 9 different cities built on top of each other as ground levels gradually rose. Chinese cities along the Yellow River are periodically buried by loess, wind-blown dust that can accumulate several feet in a single generation during particularly dry periods. This is why archaeologists excavate downward. They're not digging through mud that covered everything at once. They're digging through time, layer by layer, each stratum representing a period of occupation, abandonment, or natural accumulation. But perhaps the most dramatic real catastrophe that might underlie flood myths is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened. The Earth, which had been warming steadily as the last ice age ended, suddenly plunged back into near-glacial conditions. Temperatures dropped. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. This cold snap lasted about 1,200 years before warming resumed. Some researchers think a comet or asteroid impact triggered this climate reversal. The evidence is controversial, but there are signs. A layer of sediment rich in platinum and other materials common in space rocks. Widespread burn markers suggesting massive wildfires. Extinctions of large mammals that might have been caused by the sudden environmental changes. If the impact hypothesis is correct, it would have been catastrophic for early human populations. Floods from melting ice, wildfires across entire continents, climate disruption that made traditional hunting grounds uninhabitable, and most relevant to our story, massive amounts of meltwater suddenly released from ice sheets, potentially causing flooding on a scale that would make modern disasters look trivial. This brings us to the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. Geologists have found evidence that around 5,600 BCE, the Black Sea, which had been a freshwater lake, suddenly flooded when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus. The Mediterranean poured in, raising the Black Sea's level by hundreds of feet and inundating thousands of square miles of coastal settlements in a matter of months. Some researchers think this event might be the historical basis for flood myths from the region, including possibly the biblical flood narrative. Imagine being a Neolithic farmer living on the shores of a freshwater lake. Over the course of a single lifetime, maybe even faster, the sea invades, swallowing your village, your fields, everything you know. The survivors would flee inland, carrying stories of the great flood that destroyed their world. Similar catastrophic floods happened elsewhere. When the Laurentide ice sheet collapsed at the end of the last ice age, It released Lake Agassiz, a body of water larger than all the current Great Lakes combined. The water had to go somewhere. It carved the channeled scablands in Washington state in a matter of days, creating waterfalls larger than Niagara, moving house-sized boulders like toys, and completely transforming the landscape. If humans had been living in the path of these mega-floods, and they almost certainly were, their settlements would have been obliterated. Not buried, but scoured away entirely, with survivors left to tell tales of waters that rose higher than mountains and destroyed everything in their path. Then there's Doggerland. This is a real lost civilization, though not the kind mud flood theorists imagine. Doggerland was a landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe during the last ice age. When sea levels were 400 feet lower than today, it wasn't just a land bridge. It was a vast inhabited territory with rivers, hills, forests, and communities of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. As the ice melted, Doggerland gradually shrank. First it became an island, then an archipelago, then finally around 6,500 BCE, it disappeared beneath the North Sea. Fishing boats today occasionally pull up stone tools and even fossilized human remains from what was once dry land. The people of Doggerland watched their world slowly drown. Generation by generation, the sea advanced. Coastal settlements had to be abandoned. Hunting grounds became marshes, then lagoons, then open water. Eventually the survivors fled to higher ground in what is now Britain and Europe, carrying memories of a lost homeland beneath the waves. The same story played out in Sunderland, the vast continental shelf that connected Southeast Asian islands during the Ice Age. At its maximum extent, Sunderland was larger than India. It likely supported substantial human populations. As sea levels rose, it vanished, leaving behind only the islands we see today. The survivors' flood myths might have been passed down for thousands of years, transforming into legends of lost kingdoms and drowned civilizations. And then there's Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which isn't buried by any catastrophe, but deliberately. Around 10,000 years ago, unknown people built massive stone temples decorated with elaborate carvings. Then, for reasons nobody understands, they carefully filled the entire complex with debris and soil, burying it so completely it wasn't rediscovered until 1994. Why would anyone bury such an enormous undertaking? We don't know, but it proves that humans have been deliberately burying significant structures for at least 12,000 years, not to hide them from future historians, but for reasons that made sense in their cultural context. Religious transformation, perhaps, political change, or simply the completion of whatever ritual purpose the site served. The real history of catastrophic floods and buried cities is remarkable enough without inventing mysterious empires. Volcanoes that erase entire regions in hours, earthquakes that make the ground behave like liquid, climate changes that drown continents over centuries. These are the actual mechanisms that have buried countless human settlements throughout history. They explain everything we see in the archaeological record. The buildings with only upper floors visible, those are from volcanic lahars or liquefaction. The cities buried under dozens of feet of soil, those are from centuries of gradual sedimentation. The flood myths found in cultures worldwide, those are memories of real catastrophes, from the Black Sea deluge to the drowning of Doggerland, passed down through generations and transformed into legend. We don't need a worldwide mud flood to explain any of this. We just need geology, time, and the recognition that Earth is a dynamic, violent planet that periodically buries whatever humans build on its surface. The real mystery isn't why so many cities are buried, it's how any ancient structures survive at all. But here's the thing about these mud flood stories, these tales of buried Tartaria and lost civilizations. They're not just about architecture or geology or historical evidence. They're about something much deeper, something that lives in the human mind, something that's been part of our psychology since those early ancestors survived the bottleneck and started telling stories around fires about the world that came before. Because we are a species that needs narratives. That's not a criticism, it's just a fact. Your brain, right now as you're listening to this, is constantly constructing stories to explain what you experience. Every memory you have is actually a story your brain tells itself about what happened. And sometimes those stories are more satisfying, more emotionally resonant than the messy, complicated truth. So let's talk about why lost civilization narratives grip us so powerfully. Why millions of people find the idea of buried empires and hidden knowledge more compelling than conventional history. Why the suggestion that our ancestors were more advanced than we've been told feels not just possible, but somehow right. Start with this basic psychological fact. Humans are pattern recognition machines. That's literally what your brain evolved to do. For millions of years, the humans who survived were the ones who could spot patterns in their environment. The way certain clouds predicted storms, the tracks that indicated dangerous predators, the subtle signs that showed where food could be found. Pattern recognition kept your ancestors alive. But here's the problem with pattern recognition. It's better to see patterns that aren't there than to miss patterns that are. If your ancestor thought they saw a predator in the bushes when it was just wind, they lost nothing by being cautious. But if they failed to recognize a real predator's presence because they didn't see the pattern, they died. So natural selection favored brains that see patterns everywhere, even when those patterns don't actually exist. This is why humans see faces in clouds, why we find meaning in random coincidences, why we construct elaborate theories to explain things that might just be unconnected events. We're wired to find patterns. We can't help it. It's in our DNA. Literally selected for over millions of years of evolution. Now apply that to history. You're looking at old buildings with their first floors buried. You're seeing similar architectural styles across different continents. You're noticing that mainstream historians can't explain every single mystery of the ancient world. Your pattern recognition system lights up like a Christmas tree. There must be a connection. It tells you, these things can't be coincidence. There has to be an underlying explanation that ties it all together, and the mud flood narrative provides exactly that. One catastrophic event explains everything: the buried buildings, the lost knowledge, the architectural similarities, the gaps in the historical record. It's elegant, it's comprehensive. It makes sense of things that otherwise seem random or poorly explained. This is deeply satisfying to the human mind. Psychologists call it the need for cognitive closure, the desire to have questions answered, uncertainties resolved, patterns completed. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. Not knowing is stressful. A comprehensive explanation, even one that challenges conventional thinking, provides psychological relief. But there's something else going on too, something more profound. The idea that our ancestors possessed advanced knowledge we've lost taps into a deep human anxiety about progress itself. We're told constantly that civilization moves forward, that each generation knows more than the last, that we're smarter and more advanced than everyone who came before. But look around. Climate change threatens civilization. Nuclear weapons could destroy everything we've built. Technology that was supposed to free us seems to have enslaved us to screens and algorithms. Maybe a part of us whispers, progress isn't inevitable. Maybe civilizations can fall. Maybe knowledge can be lost. Maybe our ancestors knew things we've forgotten. This isn't paranoia. It's actually historically accurate in many cases. The Romans had concrete that lasted millennia. We're still figuring out how they made it. Medieval craftsmen built cathedrals using techniques we can't fully replicate. Ancient astronomers calculated celestial mechanics with stunning precision using nothing but patient observation and mathematics. Knowledge does get lost. Technologies do disappear. Civilizations do fall. So when someone suggests that there was an advanced civilization we don't know about, that there was a catastrophe that buried their achievements, that history is hiding something, they're not proposing something completely absurd. They're extrapolating from patterns that actually exist. The fact that they might be wrong about the specifics doesn't mean the underlying anxiety is unjustified. And let's be honest about something else. Mainstream history isn't always satisfying. It's full of gaps, uncertainties, and unanswered questions. Archaeologists will tell you they don't know something rather than speculate. Historians will say the evidence is insufficient to draw conclusions. This is intellectually honest, but it's not emotionally satisfying. You want to know what happened, you want explanations, you want the story to make sense. And when the experts say, "We don't know, we may never know, the evidence was lost to time," that's frustrating. It feels incomplete. So when an alternative theory comes along that says, "Here's what really happened, here's the pattern they're not seeing, here's the truth they're hiding," it provides something mainstream scholarship can't. Closure. Completion. A story that makes sense. There's also the psychological appeal of hidden knowledge itself. Humans love secrets. We love the idea that there's something important that most people don't know but we've figured out. Psychologists call this the conspiracy theory mindset, but that term is loaded and not entirely fair. It's really about the human need to understand, to be in the know, to have special insight. Think about how satisfying it feels when you figure something out that others haven't seen, when you connect dots that were right there but nobody else noticed. That's a real pleasure, a genuine intellectual satisfaction. Alternative history theories provide that feeling. You're not just passively accepting what you're told, you're doing your own research, drawing your own conclusions, seeing patterns that the supposed experts have missed. This is especially appealing in an age when institutions have lost credibility. And let's be clear, they have. Academic gatekeeping is real. The publish or perish culture of universities creates conformity. Theories that challenge established narratives face enormous resistance, regardless of their merit. Scientists and historians have been wrong about major things, sometimes for decades or centuries, because the institutional momentum behind the wrong answer was too strong to overcome. So when someone says, "Don't trust the mainstream historians, they're part of a system that suppresses alternative views," they're not entirely wrong. The system does suppress alternative views, sometimes for good reason because those views are contradicted by evidence, but sometimes just because they're alternative, because they don't fit the established paradigm, because accepting them would mean admitting that previous generations of scholars were wrong about something important. The mudflood theorists point to real problems with academic history. The Eurocentric bias that ignored or downplayed non-European achievements for centuries. The way inconvenient archaeological finds sometimes get dismissed or reinterpreted to fit existing theories. The fact that standard historical narratives often reflect the prejudices and assumptions of the scholars who wrote them, not necessarily objective truth. These are legitimate criticisms. The response shouldn't be, trust the experts, they know better than you. It should be, you're right that scholarship has problems, let's examine the evidence together and see what conclusions we can draw. But here's where it gets tricky, because the same pattern recognition that helps us see real connections can lead us astray. Confirmation bias is real, and it affects everyone, not just believers in alternative theories. Once you've decided that there was a mud flood, you start seeing evidence for it everywhere. Buildings with buried first floors become proof, even though there are multiple mundane explanations for why that happens. Similar architectural styles across cultures become evidence of a lost empire, even though there are only so many ways to stack stones efficiently, and humans independently arrive at similar solutions to similar problems. This is where critical thinking becomes essential. Not critical in the sense of being negative, but critical in the sense of examining evidence carefully, considering alternative explanations, and being willing to change your mind when new information emerges. The most intellectually honest position about many historical mysteries is uncertainty. We don't know everything about the past. We probably never will. Archaeological evidence is fragmentary. Historical records are incomplete and biased. There are genuine mysteries that conventional scholarship hasn't adequately explained. But we don't know doesn't automatically mean, therefore this alternative explanation must be true. It means we don't know. The space of uncertainty is real and legitimate. You can sit in that space, comfortable with not having all the answers, curious about what future discoveries might reveal, without committing to theories that require you to ignore or reinterpret vast amounts of established evidence. Here's what's really interesting, though. The appeal of lost civilization narratives isn't just about being right or wrong, it's about wonder. It's about the possibility that the world is stranger and more mysterious than the standard story suggests. It's about maintaining a sense of awe about the past and the possibility of discovery. This is actually healthy. A purely materialistic, purely rationalistic view of history can strip away the magic and wonder. Mainstream archaeology sometimes presents the past in such dry, technical terms that it feels dead. Just dates and artifacts and peer-reviewed papers. But the past wasn't like that. It was lived by real people with hopes and dreams and fears. They looked at the same stars we see and wondered what they meant. They created things we still find beautiful. They survived catastrophes we can barely imagine. The mud flood narratives, the stories of lost Tartaria, the speculation about advanced ancient civilizations, they're all attempts to reconnect with that sense of wonder, to feel that the past matters, that it has secrets to reveal, that there are still mysteries worth exploring. The problem isn't the wonder. Wonder is good. Curiosity is essential. The willingness to question established narratives has led to genuine historical revelations. The problem is when wonder becomes certainty without evidence, when curiosity stops seeking and starts asserting, when questioning established narratives means rejecting all evidence that contradicts what you want to believe. Because here's the beautiful thing about real history, the messy, complicated, evidence-based version. It's actually more wonderful than the simplified alternative narratives. The story of how humans spread across the planet, adapting to every environment from deserts to Arctic tundra, the way different cultures independently developed agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, the genuine mysteries that remain, like how exactly the pyramids were built, or what caused the Bronze Age collapse, or why humans suddenly started creating art 40,000 years ago. These real historical puzzles don't require us to imagine lost super-civilizations or global catastrophes that erased all records. They just require patience, careful study, and the humility to say, we don't fully understand this yet, but we're working on it. And here's the thing about genuine scholarly research. It's actually full of wonder and mystery and ongoing debates. Archaeologists argue passionately about interpretations of evidence. Historians propose radical new theories that overturn decades of previous understanding. Ancient DNA is rewriting everything we thought we knew about human migration and interbreeding between species. The real story is dynamic, evolving, full of surprises and controversies. You don't have to reject mainstream scholarship to find mystery and excitement in the past. You just have to actually engage with it, read beyond the dry textbooks, follow the cutting-edge research where the real debates and discoveries are happening. So maybe the question isn't whether the mud flood theories are true or false. Maybe it's what psychological needs they're fulfilling, and whether those needs can be met in other ways. The need to question authority, to see patterns, to feel wonder about the past, to believe that there are still mysteries worth exploring. All of these are legitimate and important. The challenge is fulfilling these needs while maintaining intellectual honesty, being curious without being credulous, questioning established narratives without rejecting all evidence, feeling wonder about the past without needing to invent mysteries that aren't there. Because the real past, the actual complex, messy history of humanity, is wonderful enough. You don't need mud floods to make it interesting. You just need to look at it with eyes that can still see wonder in the ordinary miracle of human survival, adaptation, and achievement across hundreds of thousands of years. We are a species that survived near extinction, spread across the planet, developed thousands of unique cultures, and somehow managed to build civilizations despite countless disasters and setbacks. That story, the real one supported by evidence, is more remarkable than any lost empire or buried civilization could ever be. But the psychology that draws us to those alternative narratives isn't wrong. It's deeply human. We're all descendants of people who survived by spotting patterns, by questioning what they were told, by imagining possibilities that others couldn't see. Sometimes that psychology leads us to truth. Sometimes it leads us astray. The key is knowing the difference. And maybe, just maybe, being willing to live with uncertainty when the evidence doesn't clearly point one way or another, because that's where real discovery happens. Not in certainty, but in the questions we're still trying to answer. But here's the thing about all these mud flood legends and tales of lost Tartarian empires. Sometimes when you strip away the speculation and conspiracy theories, you're left with something even more fascinating. Real mysteries. Actual unexplained archaeological findings that don't require global cover-ups or alternative timelines to be genuinely puzzling. Because the truth is, we don't have all the answers about human history, not even close. And the more we dig, literally and figuratively, the more we realize how much we don't know. Let's start with something concrete, something you can go see in a museum right now if you want to feel your understanding of ancient technology completely rearranged. The Antikythera mechanism. Found in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, this device sat in storage for decades because nobody could figure out what the hell it was. Just a corroded lump of bronze with gears inside. Interesting, but not earth-shattering. Then researchers started actually examining it properly, X-raying it, mapping the gear trains, reconstructing how it worked, and what they found was impossible. Except it wasn't impossible because it was right there in their hands. The Antikythera mechanism is a astronomical calculator built around 100 BCE. But it's not just any calculator. It contains differential gearing technology that wouldn't appear again in human history until the 18th century. It could predict eclipses, track the movements of the sun and moon, follow the paths of planets, even account for the irregular orbit of the moon using epicyclic gearing that represents mathematical concepts we didn't think the ancient Greeks understood in quite this way. It's got at least 30 meshing bronze gears in a device no bigger than a shoebox. The precision required to craft those gears by hand is staggering. The astronomical knowledge encoded in its gear ratios is profound. And here's what really keeps archaeologists awake at night. It can't be the only one. Complex devices like this don't just appear fully formed. There had to be earlier versions, simpler prototypes, a whole technological tradition of mechanical engineering that produced this masterpiece. But we've never found any of them. The Antikythera mechanism stands alone in the archaeological record, a technological marvel with no ancestors and apparently no descendants until over 1,500 years later. Did the knowledge get lost? Was it kept secret by a small group of craftsmen who died without passing on their skills? Were there once dozens, maybe hundreds of similar devices that simply haven't survived? We don't know. We may never know. But the device exists. It's not speculation or legend. It's sitting in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, quietly suggesting that ancient technological sophistication might have peaked and valleys were only beginning to recognize. Or take Damascus steel. For nearly 1,000 years, bladesmiths in the Middle East produced swords with properties that modern metallurgists still struggle to replicate. These blades could cut through a silk scarf floating in the air, yet were tough enough to chop through other swords without breaking. They showed distinctive watery patterns in the metal that indicated a microstructure of carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires. Yes, nanotechnology in medieval swords. The technique was lost sometime around 1750 CE, just vanished from human knowledge. We think it involved specific ore from mines in India combined with particular forging techniques, but we're not entirely sure. Modern attempts to recreate Damascus steel have come close, but metallurgists admit they're essentially reverse engineering through trial and error, trying to rediscover a process that craftsmen once knew so well they could produce these extraordinary blades consistently. The knowledge didn't require a lost empire or global catastrophe to disappear. It just took the exhaustion of particular ore sources, the death of master craftsmen before their apprentices fully learned the techniques, and the economic disruption of changing trade routes. Within a couple of generations, one of humanity's most remarkable metallurgical achievements became a mystery. Roman concrete tells a similar story. The Romans built harbours, aqueducts, and massive structures like the Pantheon using a concrete formula that has survived 2,000 years of weathering, including underwater exposure to corrosive seawater. Modern concrete starts degrading after 50 years. The Roman formula was lost during the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and wasn't fully understood again until the 21st century. Researchers finally figured out that Roman concrete used volcanic ash in a specific way that created a mineral called aluminum tobermarite, which actually makes the concrete stronger over time, especially when exposed to seawater. The ancient Romans probably didn't understand the chemistry. They just knew that concrete made with ash from certain volcanoes worked incredibly well. They had empirical knowledge that took us centuries to recover and understand scientifically. And how much else was lost? How many other practical techniques, architectural insights, or engineering solutions disappeared during periods of social collapse? only to be slowly rediscovered, or never recovered at all. Then you have entire civilizations that simply vanished, leaving behind monumental architecture and more questions than answers. The Indus Valley civilization flourished for nearly 1,000 years, roughly from 3,300 to 1300 BCE. At its peak, it was larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, with sophisticated city planning that included grid layouts, advanced drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and possibly the world's first flushing toilets. The city of Mohenjo-Daro had better urban planning than most modern cities: straight streets, covered sewers, multi-story buildings with private wells and bathrooms. Then around 1900 BCE, it started declining. By 1300 BCE, it was essentially gone. People abandoned the cities. The writing system was forgotten. We still can't read Indus Valley script. Despite thousands of inscribed artifacts, nobody has successfully deciphered it. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know their religious beliefs. We don't know their political structure or why they declined. Various theories suggest climate change, shifting river patterns, invasion, or disease. But the truth is, we don't know. An entire civilization that lasted longer than the United States has existed so far just faded away, leaving behind ruins we can measure and describe but can't truly understand. The Minoans of Crete met a similarly mysterious end. They built palaces with sophisticated plumbing, created beautiful frescoes, and developed a writing system we've partially deciphered called Linear A. Then around 1450 BCE, their civilization collapsed. The Mycenaeans from mainland Greece took over Crete, and Minoan culture essentially disappeared. Was it the massive volcanic eruption on Thera that devastated the region? Tsunami damage, economic collapse, invasion? Probably some combination, but the specifics remain frustratingly unclear. And Linear A, this script that might tell us about Minoan religion, politics, and daily life, remains largely undeciphered. We can sound out the syllables, but we don't know what language they represent. The ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest built massive cliff dwellings and complex multi-story pueblos, then largely abandoned them in the 13th century. Chaco Canyon was a massive cultural center with great houses containing hundreds of rooms. Then the people dispersed. Tree ring analysis suggests severe droughts. But was it just drought, or were there social factors, religious changes, conflict over resources? The archaeological record shows migration patterns, but it doesn't explain the full story of why such an established culture would abandon the settlements their ancestors had built over centuries. And let's talk about the structures themselves, the megalithic constructions that still baffle engineers today. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey dates to around 9600 BCE. It's older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than writing by thousands of years. Yet it shows sophisticated architectural planning and stone carving techniques. The stone pillars weigh up to 20 tons. They're carved with elaborate reliefs of animals. And this wasn't built by settled farmers with surplus resources. This was built by hunter-gatherers, people we've traditionally thought of as living hand-to-mouth existences. Yet somehow they organized labor forces, transported massive stones, and created a monumental complex for what was probably religious purposes. It suggests social organization and cultural sophistication far earlier than we previously imagined. Göbekli Tepe didn't rewrite history, it rewrote prehistory. The stone blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon include the largest hewn stone blocks ever used in construction. The stone of the pregnant woman weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. It's still in the quarry, partially cut free from the bedrock. We know the Romans built the temple complex at Baalbek, but these foundation stones might be earlier, and regardless of who cut them, the engineering challenges are immense. How do you transport a 1,000-ton block in the ancient world? How do you even conceive of attempting such a thing? Modern cranes can handle it, but ancient engineers had only ropes, rollers, levers, and human labour. They must have had techniques we don't fully understand. Not alien technology or lost civilizations from Atlantis, just engineering knowledge that wasn't written down, wasn't preserved, and has to be deduced from the physical evidence they left behind. The same applies to Puma Punku in Bolivia. The stone blocks there show extremely precise cutting, some with interlocking joints that fit together with minimal gaps. The precision suggests advanced planning and sophisticated tools, again, not beyond human capability, but representing knowledge we have to reconstruct because it wasn't transmitted to us directly. Here's what's truly humbling. The overwhelming majority of human history wasn't written down. Writing only emerged around 5,000 years ago. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That means 98% of human existence happened before anyone was recording it. And even after writing emerged, most knowledge remained oral. Practical skills were taught through demonstration, not texts. When those teaching lineages broke, the knowledge disappeared. The destruction of libraries accelerated this loss catastrophically. The Library of Alexandria is the famous example. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, it was the largest library in the ancient world. Estimates suggest it contained somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls. Works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, history, literature from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Then it burned. Actually, it probably burned several times, once during Julius Caesar's civil war, again possibly during riots in 272 CE, and finally destroyed when the Emperor Theodosius ordered pagan temples demolished in 391 CE. With it went countless works that existed nowhere else. Plays, scientific treatises, historical accounts, mathematical proofs. We know many existed only because later authors mentioned them. We have the citations, but not the texts. Entire bodies of knowledge reduced to footnotes. The same happened repeatedly throughout history. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols in 1258. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded upon Greek, Persian and Indian knowledge for centuries. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad, they threw so many books into the Tigris that the river supposedly ran black with ink. The Mayans had a sophisticated writing system and produced thousands of bark paper books called codices. Spanish conquistadors and missionaries burned nearly all of them as pagan texts. Only 4 Maya codices survived. 4 books to represent an entire civilization's written knowledge. Everything else, their history, science, literature, religious philosophy, gone. Reduced to ash because someone decided it was dangerous or heretical. We can't know what was lost in these destructions. Maybe nothing that would overturn our understanding of history. Or maybe astronomical observations, mathematical insights, or practical knowledge that would have advanced human understanding by centuries. We'll never know because the knowledge is simply gone. This is the truly unsettling part. The gaps in our knowledge aren't just about ancient civilizations. They're everywhere. And then there's what's still buried or underwater, waiting to be discovered. Recent advances in underwater archaeology have revealed entire coastal settlements, lost to rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Doggerland, the landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe, was above water until about 8,000 years ago. It was inhabited. Fishermen occasionally dredge up Stone Age tools from the North Sea. But the settlements, the camps, the pathways people walked, they're all underwater now. What societies existed there? What happened when the waters rose? The same applies to coastlines worldwide. Sea levels were 120 meters lower during the last glacial maximum. All those coastal areas, prime real estate for human settlement, are now underwater. And humans have always preferred coastal living. Reliable food sources, easy travel routes, moderate climates. If advanced societies developed anywhere 15,000 years ago, they were probably on coastlines that are now submerged. We're only beginning to search those underwater landscapes systematically. Already we're finding structures, tools, and evidence of human activity. What else is down there? And above water, the vast majority of archaeological sites remain unexcavated. Most of what we know about past civilizations comes from sites that were obvious, easy to access, or stumbled upon by accident. There's been no systematic survey of most of the Earth's surface looking for archaeological remains. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, and satellite imagery are starting to change this. Recent LiDAR surveys in Central America revealed thousands of previously unknown Maya structures hidden under jungle canopy. Entire cities that had been invisible suddenly appeared in the data. How many more are out there? How many civilizations rose and fell in regions we simply haven't surveyed properly? The Amazon rainforest might have supported large, complex societies before European contact. Recent discoveries suggest extensive earthworks, roads, and settlements that were abandoned and reclaimed by the jungle. We've been looking at the Amazon as pristine wilderness when it might have been heavily modified by human activity for thousands of years. So here's the balance we need to strike. Yes, we should be skeptical of claims that require massive conspiracies, or that reject basic science. The mudflood hypothesis as typically presented doesn't hold up to geological scrutiny. The Tartarian Empire as a world-spanning advanced civilization suppressed by modern historians simply doesn't exist in the evidence. But that doesn't mean we know everything. It doesn't mean established archaeology has all the answers. Real mysteries exist. The Antikythera mechanism is genuinely baffling. Damascus steel was genuinely lost. The Indus Valley civilization genuinely disappeared, leaving questions we can't answer. Göbekli Tepe genuinely challenged our assumptions about prehistoric society. And vast amounts of human history remain undiscovered, unexcavated, or lost to time and destruction. The appropriate response isn't to invent elaborate alternative histories without evidence, but it's also not to pretend we've got everything figured out. The truth, as usual, is more nuanced. We know a remarkable amount about the past through careful archaeology, geology, and historical analysis. But we also exist in a kind of twilight, looking back through incomplete records at a human story that stretches far beyond what any text can tell us. The mysteries that remain are real. They don't need embellishment to be fascinating. An ancient Greek computer, steel with carbon nanotubes, concrete that grows stronger with time, civilizations that vanished, knowledge that was lost, cities beneath the waves, and everything still buried, still waiting to be found. That's the real story. Not hidden empires or global catastrophes, but the genuine wonder and humility that comes from recognizing how much of human achievement has been forgotten, how much remains unknown, and how much we're still learning about who we were and how we got here. The past doesn't need conspiracy theories to be mysterious. It just needs honesty about the limits of our knowledge and openness to the possibility that our ancestors were more capable, more sophisticated, and more interesting than we sometimes give them credit for. Not because they had help from lost civilizations or ancient aliens, but because they were human, problem solvers, innovators, builders who figured things out through trial and error and passed knowledge down through generations, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And when that knowledge was lost, it wasn't because of cover-ups. It was because of the fragile nature of human memory, the vulnerability of written records, and the simple fact that sometimes things fall apart. Empires collapse, libraries burn, techniques are forgotten, and the people who remain have to start over, rebuilding knowledge from whatever fragments survived. That's the real human story. Not hidden and suppressed, just incomplete. And in some ways, that's even more compelling than any alternative history could ever be. So here we are. We've journeyed through mud flood legends and tales of buried civilizations, explored architectural mysteries and geological realities, wandered through the ruins of Tartaria that never was, and discovered the catastrophes that actually happened. We've examined why these stories captivate us, and what they reveal about the human need to find meaning in the fragments of history scattered around us. And here's the thing. The mud flood legends aren't really about mud, or floods, or buried buildings. They're about something much deeper. They're about our desperate need to believe that the world once made more sense than it does now. That there was a time when humans built grander, thought bigger, achieved more. That something magnificent was lost and maybe, just maybe, could be recovered. This isn't new. Every generation tells itself stories about golden ages and fallen empires. The Greeks mourned the lost wisdom of Atlantis. Medieval Europeans dreamed of the grandeur of Rome. Victorian scholars imagined vanished super-civilizations that built the pyramids and Stonehenge. We're just doing the same thing with different details, different mysteries, different architectural anomalies that don't quite fit our expectations. But here's what's remarkable. While we've been chasing phantom empires and imaginary floods, we've overlooked genuine mysteries that are somehow even more astounding. Real architectural achievements by societies we barely understand. Actual climate catastrophes that nearly ended human civilization. Technologies that shouldn't have existed when they did. Connections between cultures that had no business knowing about each other. The truth is, you don't need to invent lost civilizations to find wonder in the past. It's already there. Every archaeological site holds secrets. Every ancient text contains knowledge we're still trying to decode. Every genetic analysis reveals something unexpected about who our ancestors were and what they survived. We're all living in a world shaped by catastrophes we can barely imagine. Climate disasters that killed off entire branches of humanity. Volcanic eruptions that changed the course of civilizations. Floods, droughts, and plagues that wiped out empires and scattered survivors to the winds. These actually happened. The evidence is written in ice cores and sediment layers, preserved in tree rings and fossilized bones, and somehow through all of it, humans survived. Not because we were the strongest or the fastest, but because we were the ones who could tell stories, share knowledge, cooperate across generations. The ones who could look at a catastrophe and figure out how to rebuild. The ones who could take the ruins of the old world and create something new. That's the real story of humanity. Not a tale of perfection lost, but of resilience found. Not ancient super-civilizations with technologies we can't comprehend, but ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and somehow making it through. Not buried empires erased by conspiracy, but societies that rose and fell according to the brutal logic of climate, disease, and human nature. The mudflood legends are wrong about the details, but maybe they're right about something deeper, the sense that something important has been forgotten, that we've lost connection with knowledge our ancestors possessed, because we have lost things, not technologies or empires, but understanding, the ability to read landscapes like our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, the astronomical knowledge that let ancient cultures track celestial cycles without computers, the social bonds that held communities together through disasters that would shatter modern society. We don't need to invent phantom civilizations to mourn those losses. We just need to pay attention to what actually existed and take the time to understand what it meant. Mystery and wonder can exist alongside scientific understanding. In fact, scientific understanding usually makes things more mysterious, more wondrous, more impossible seeming. The real story of human survival is so improbable, so filled with near extinctions and last-minute recoveries that any fiction we invent pales by comparison. So stay curious. Question everything, including the official narratives and the alternative theories. Dig into the evidence. Learn to tell the difference between genuine mysteries and pattern-seeking gone wrong. The past has plenty of real secrets waiting to be discovered. You don't need to make up new ones. If you've enjoyed this journey through mudflood legends and the stories we tell ourselves about the past, consider liking this video and subscribing for more explorations of history's genuine mysteries. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what historical rabbit holes you'd like to explore next. Your engagement helps these videos reach other curious minds, other people who can't quite fall asleep because they're wondering about the world that came before. And now, as you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander through those ancient streets. Not the imaginary mud-flooded cities of Tartaria, but the real ruins of civilizations that actually rose and fell. Real people who loved and struggled and built and dreamed and left their marks on the world. Their stories are still being written in the layers of earth beneath our feet, waiting for someone curious enough to dig them up. Sleep well. The mysteries will still be there in the morning.